If you've ever treated SIBO and watched it come right back, you're not alone. But what if I told you that SIBO isn't the problem? It's the result of a bigger issue that's been building for years before the bacteria ever showed up. Most people think that SIBO happens because the bacteria invade the small intestine. But what if I told you that those bacteria, well, they've always been there. So why are they thriving now when they didn't before? Short answer, the terrain. That's the environment inside your digestive system. And when that digestive function has been weakening and that terrain has been becoming less optimal for decades because of eating in ways that shut down your digestion, that don't optimize your digestive secretions, or routinely exposing yourself to foods that have low quality or a lack of nutrients in them, or just maybe simply that you just don't have a good relationship with food. I mean, you really haven't bonded with the food and given it a lot of thought as it relates to your gut health. Well, that's eating from a conventional mindset, and it's not going to support optimizing the terrain of the GI tract. How do you course correct? Well, quite simply, you're going to get personal with food to start out with, truly develop that relationship with it that is going to allow you to understand when you're feeding these organisms, these beneficial bacteria in your gut, so you have an overgrowth of the wrong type of organisms, but ask yourself, are you feeding the beneficial organisms that need to be there? And also just routinely consuming as a part of your diet the different herbs in your diet. So for example, bacteria balancing herbs, having routine exposure to these, mint, oregano, garlic, thyme, and many others that fall into this same category. These can all be extremely beneficial to keep in control of that terrain. Or maybe just slowing down when you're eating and optimizing your digestive secretions. After all, if these digestive secretions aren't functioning at optimal levels on a day-to-day basis, well, you just kick the door wide open for SIBO to set in. And it's also important here to prioritize how you eat over what you eat. And remember, guys, when I say how, your gut needs rest too. You go and do a workout, you need to rest and recover from that workout. Every time you eat food, you're asking your GI tract to do a workout, and you need to give it rest time to do the other capabilities and functions that it needs to give you an optimal digestive experience. So the solution to SIBO, which is the most common form of bacterial overgrowth in the gut, well, it's really not about the bacteria at all. It's actually about the conditions, the terrain that invite those bacteria to start to function. And when you do rebuild that terrain with nutrient-dense food and you're consuming that consistently and being very intentional in that food consumption, SIBO becomes far less likely to manifest. You just haven't created situations that optimize for it. Now, if this concept that I've shared with you here briefly makes sense, that fixing the terrain is what's going to be the ultimate and powerful deterrent against the continual chasing microbes that's often termed as SIBO, well, why don't you go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to connect these types of dots for you every week. And if you want to understand more about how your modern habits are influencing these microbes and your digestive function, well, that's where we're going next. We're going to take a deeper dive. But before I take that deeper dive with you, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I'm both a doctor and a rancher with a purpose. And for over more than 2 decades now, I've worked with patients who have been battling long-term gastrointestinal dysfunction, and maybe that looks like bloating, fatigue, discomfort that they just don't find resolution from, that just doesn't seem to want to go away. Well, we dig in and I help them restore their gut health through real food recommendations that optimize their digestion and support natural balance. Oh, and by the way, I also raise nutrient-dense food here at Harvest Hills Ranch because I believe that the solution to chronic gut problems, that begins long before whatever shows up on your plate. Can we talk for a moment here about why SIBO is so prevalent? Let's just get down to the truth behind this and the facts. And to do this, I want to set the stage by what is generally considered an old medical argument, if you will, that still holds true in this SIBO conversation and really throughout a lot of healthcare today. And it boils down to the germ theory of disease. Many of you may have heard the name Louis Pasteur, and pasteurization is the connection there. You may have heard pasteurization if you haven't heard Louis Pasteur, but if you think pasteurization, you're killing off the germs. The thought is that those germs are going to lead to disease, and that was Louis Pasteur's thought process, is that microbes are the cause of illness. Well, it turns out while we often hear about Louis Pasteur as the main part of this story, there was another individual who was equally relevant in this conversation, and this is where the argument, really probably better stated as debate, comes into play, and it's from a guy named Antoine Béchamp. And Béchamp looked at this a little bit differently. He looked at this from the perspective of the terrain. And the idea here is that this is the body's internal environment. And if you create an environment in your body that is hospitable for microorganisms to persist and, more importantly, thrive, well, guess what? They start to take over and they create dysfunction. And Béchamp actually had an interesting statement where he said in 1883 that the microbe is nothing. The terrain is everything. Well, we know how history played out here, and it's that Pasteur's theory won. But interestingly enough, over time, we also see that Béchamp may have been proven right more than not here. And one example I can give you on this is fungal infections or candida overgrowth. When you look at candida and fungal overgrowths, many times the reason that these onset is because the individual that's struggling with this has succumbed to a weakened immune system. The terrain has become weakened. It has become more hospitable for these problematic organisms. And the same story holds very much true when we're talking about SIBO. We've opened the door because of a change in terrain to these bacteria to start to overgrow in the small intestine. The bacteria aren't invading the gut as is so often thought about here and as the treatment ideology is so often geared towards. They're actually just functioning in an optimal terrain that has lost the ability to be able to regulate itself. So in that mindset, well, where does the focus need to be? Well, it needs to be on the terrain. Now, before I give you the solution here, we should ask the question, what weakens the terrain? Allow me to present an analogy to you, which is the analogy of landscape. Just think trees, shrubs, grasses, and how beautiful that optimal scenic landscape looks. You get a good visual in your mind as I'm talking about this, and then compare that to what you see as a trash-littered environment. Think about a landfill, if you will, where you've just got trash everywhere. Those are two very different pictures. And again, that's very analogous to what we talk about in regards to the landscape in your gastrointestinal tract. We want to consume real food that is going to create the optimal environment. And that's in contrast to the consumption of, whether you call this manufactured food, processed food, ultra-processed food, however you want to look at that. The idea is that that beautiful scenic landscape looks that way because that environment has developed to a point where it is self-sustaining, meaning that it continues to nourish itself because the exposure within that environment, it just continues to feed itself. And again, you compare that against more of a trash environment, if you will, where things continue to degrade and they don't become better over time. They become worse over time. Well, if you're no longer nourishing the environment of your gastrointestinal tract, then you're probably toxifying it, which means that there's routine exposure to nutrient-poor food, chemical-laden food, and all of these things are going to shift the microbial profile in the wrong direction, but they're also going to make your digestive secretions less efficient over time. And did I mention stress? Well, stress is a huge factor here, and however stress looks like for you, whether it's chemical, emotional, physiological, physical, structural, whatever that stress looks like for you, as that cumulative stress comes on, it's ultimately going to dampen the resiliency of the body, which means from a digestive standpoint, slower motility. But when you have slower motility in your bowels, you're not cleaning the bowels out. The movement of things through your small intestine into the large intestine, that natural flushing response, it doesn't happen as efficiently. And as that motility gets slowed down, you get an accumulation of bacteria. And add to that the reduced digestive secretions, which are also truly all defense lines, if you will, the acid, the bile, the enzymes. These must all be in place to not solely digest food, but to act as a defensive barrier against the overgrowth of that bacteria, as well as other organisms in your small intestine. And you couple that with, many of us have seen that individuals that are chronically exposed to stress, they run themselves in the ground. This is the classic type A personality, but you don't have to be a type A personality to experience what I'm talking about here. But ultimately, this scenario, this chronic stress load is going to weaken the immune system. You only have so many resources to go around, and if your resources that you're taking in and have stored are ultimately getting shunted towards dealing with stress, they're doing that at the expense of the immune system. You may also find that some other factors here that are part of modern life that are going to lead to weakening the terrain. Well, if you're eating too frequently or eating on the go, never actually sitting down and truly being in a more relaxed state of mind when you're eating, or if you're just grazing and eating all the time, that's not optimal for keeping those bacteria at bay. And then also looking at drugs, right? Not illicit drugs. I'm talking about over-the-counter and prescription drugs here, whether it's antibiotics or acid blockers or painkiller medications. These can all be associated with changing the terrain. Any change in that terrain moving through the stomach, the small intestine, and even the upper portion of your colon, any change throughout that area is kicking the door open for SIBO to manifest. And to give you another analogy here, I talked about the stagnancy in this environment, just having stagnant digestion. Think about a stagnant pond where you see accumulation of mosses and this overgrowth on the pond that happens over time, and you contrast that against a flowing river where you don't see things building up on the surface because there's this constant movement there. The same analogy holds true when we're talking about your GI tract. And so rather than taking this approach of blaming the microbes, what we should probably be doing is looking at a failed terrain first. Don't worry, I'm getting ready to deliver the good news here, because there is a solution that you can lean into, and it's really based around the fact that the terrain can be rebuilt. If you've been pretty harsh on your body and you've created an environment that is not optimal for balance and it's optimal for overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, let me tell you how to change that. And I'm going to start with a foundation of correction, which is food. Now, it does not mean that herbs and supplements and even medications don't have a place. They can help rebuild the terrain initially, but and I've got other content that you can look at around those topics, but we're talking about building the terrain from the foundational level. And if you're compromising food, well, quite frankly, you're going to struggle on an ongoing basis with building a terrain that is inhospitable for this overgrowth in your small intestine. For digestion truly to respond its best, that means that you're going to have to start thinking about nutrient density in your food. You're going to have to start thinking about mineral richness. These nutrients, whether it's the fat-soluble vitamins, whether it's your antioxidants, whether it's secondary metabolites in these foods, the minerals, all of these things are nourishing the microbiota, the immune system, and the integrity of your gastrointestinal tract. And without those, you should just literally expect that at some point, those systems are going to succumb to those inadequacies. So nutrient density, food quality, Well, it does matter. Biologically active food matters. And if you're an individual who thinks about your diet in terms of calories or even in terms of macros, and you're not thinking on a bigger level about your food as being a signaling molecule, as being an aid to the microbiota in your stomach or in your small intestine and even your large intestine, if you're not shifting away from that caloric, just simple macronutrient concept about food, you're missing the bigger picture about how valuable food can be. And really, to further drive this point, I would say that when you're looking to choose foods, your choice for foods needs to be those that are raised in living soil. And that means that for plant-based foods, you need to know where these foods are coming from, how much nutrient density is being driven into these foods. So if you can develop a relationship with someone who's growing and producing these foods, or even produce these foods yourself, you're going to know much more about that. But that's also relevant on the animal-based side as well. So for example, like here at Harvest Hills Ranch, where we're raising animals in a regenerative manner, and every action I take with our livestock, with our animals, is geared towards trying to push more nutrition into that animal, which correlates to higher nutrient density in the food. You want to include healthy fats and proteins. These are going to be things that are going to stimulate optimal acid and bileflow. So oftentimes, there's so much attention just geared towards avoidance of various sectors of carbohydrates in the diet, but instead of thinking about what do I avoid, think about what do I include. You want to look at what food classes I need to lean into to optimize the terrain. Salt. Here's another one. Salt is going to stimulate digestion. You have tongue receptors on your tongue that are literally signaling your vagus nerve, your nervous system, that is triggering the response all the way down to your stomach to release the acid in your stomach. And that salt is also delivering chloride, which is needed for hydrochloric acid production. And while you're at it, and you're creating some diversity in your diet, and you're really going to the next level, putting a lot of intention in your diet, go ahead and start finding use for herbs in your diet, or oregano, or garlic, mint, these kinds of things, onions, all of these chives. I'm just thinking of some of these that are coming to mind. All of these are adding an antimicrobial element, as well as many other secondary benefits that when you start to learn to use these either as additions to your food, or drink teas from these, or however you want to use them, these are all going to further build a terrain that is not going to be hospitable for an overgrowth in the small intestine. It is the terrain. And remember, I'm giving you simple steps. Simple doesn't mean rudimentary, right? Simple in this case just means be consistent, because fundamentally simplicity is going to win out here. You're freeing yourself from these unsubstantiated, restricting diets that so many individuals that talk about this topic lean into, that are just not validated. They're not evidence-based here, and I want to give you content and information that you can lean on. And listen, even from a mental standpoint, who wants to be told you can't when you could easily get more benefit from looking at what you can work with? It just logically makes sense. And if you're going to strengthen the terrain, well, what you're going to find is that balance is going to return on its own. Clearly, SIBO is not really about the bacteria. It's about the conditions that invite them in. And when the terrain is strong, digestion's flowing like it should, you're getting good acid and bile and enzymes that are doing their job, balance is going to follow naturally. And if this idea of rebuilding the terrain through food makes sense to you, well, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and make sure that you share this video with someone who's still out there dealing with symptoms and not finding solutions. And when you're ready to take the next step, well, go ahead and watch this video over here, SIBO versus SIFO. It'll help you understand the other side of this story.